very warm welcome to today's talk. My name is Bethany Gaunt and I am Associate Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. The centre was set up several years ago by Lady Esther Gilbert and Sir Harry Solomon to honour Sir Martin's legacy and make history engaging and accessible for all. So we have our popular online talk series where we invite leading scholars to share their work on subjects linked to Sir Martin's own research fields. And we also offer sessions and resources for secondary school history teachers. Now, a real highlight of my job is welcoming Lady Esther for her ever popular readings. Esther, who joins us tonight from Canada, was not only instrumental in setting up this centre, but she continues to work diligently to ensure that Sir Martin's incredibly impressive 88 books are kept in print and accessible for new generations of scholars. I would encourage you all to visit her website, martingilbert.com, which is a superb source of information about Sir Martin's extensive works, and where you can sign up for Esther's monthly newsletter, in which she shares excerpts of his writing. And I will post a link in the chat in just a moment. In her readings series, Lady Esther draws together excerpts from Sir Martin's vast array of books around a certain topic. And today's topic, as you will no doubt be aware, is D-Day. So today marks the 80th anniversary of what was the largest seaborne invasion in history and an absolutely pivotal moment in World War II. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us to mark this anniversary, and thank you, Esther, for giving up your time to share these works with us tonight. So without further ado, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you for joining us to remember D-Day 80 years ago today. You'll be pleased. I'm pleased that this is on Zoom because I'm getting some sort of scratchy throat. So if I start croaking away, you'll understand. It's maybe more mellifluous than I usually am. What happened on D-Day? We hear about those who were killed, but why was that day so important? Martin's books that cover 1944 all have a D-Day aspect. I will be reading from 6 of them on the planning, execution, and the result of the Normandy landings. So let me just see if I can do the technical. Sorry. Someday I'll get this.
It's just the play button.
Yeah, but I have a box here that's in the way.
Ah.
Okay. Ah.
There you go.
Ta-da! Success. Thank you. So now we can move on to our first bit. This is on the landing itself from Martin's Second World War, A Complete History. By dawn on June 6, 18,000 British and American parachutists were on the ground in Normandy, capturing essential bridges and disrupting German lines of communication. At 6:30 that morning, the first troops landed, Americans coming ashore at Utah Beach with amphibious tanks. Less than an hour later, at 7:25, the first British soldiers came ashore at Gold and Sword beaches, followed at Juno Beach by 2,400 Canadians, supported by 76 of the amphibious tanks. At 10:15 that morning, the news of these landings was brought to Rommel, who was still in Germany. He at once flew back to France, instructed by Hitler to drive the invaders back into the sea by midnight. By midnight, 155,000 Allied troops were already ashore. Only at Omaha Beach had the German defenders been able to pin down the American assaulting force of nearly 35,000 men to a perimeter of no more than a mile deep. At all the other landing grounds, much greater progress inland had been made. Hitler, convinced that the Normandy landing was not the real second front, hesitated to commit his full resources to the bridgehead. That day, German naval units were warned to be prepared for surprise attacks elsewhere. This message was decrypted by the British that evening, giving the Allied commanders some assurance that even on June 7, D-Day +1, the full force of the German military might would not be thrown against them. The Allied casualties on D-Day had been relatively low. 355 Canadians had been killed in action or died of wounds, as compared with more than 900 Canadian dead at Dieppe in 1942. Both the Americans and the British each lost more than 1,000 men killed during the first day of battle. On June 7, as the Allies consolidated their position on the Normandy beachhead and sought to enlarge them, the German Air Force High Command was still warning its units in Western Europe that further landings could be expected either for a thrust toward Belgium or in Norway or near Lorient on the French Atlantic coast or on the western coast of the Cotentin Peninsula. How did we get there? This is on some of the planning and challenges for the lead up to the landings from Martin's D-Day. From the moment France was overrun by the German army in June 1940, it was clear that Germany could only be driven out of its Western European conquests by a cross-channel assault. It was also clear that British soil, which at its closest point was visible from the coast of German-occupied France, would have to be the launching ground. Following the Dunkirk evacuation, when 338,226 British, French, and other Allied troops had been evacuated, Hitler's military strength offered him the prospect of the mastery of Europe. To challenge that mastery, a much larger army would be needed to cross back over the Channel. Britain's military resources by themselves could never be sufficient for such a return in the strength needed to offer any prospect of success. Only if the United States, with its potential air, land, and naval strength, including landing craft, were to enter the war, would a return to Europe be possible. But even while substantially assisting Britain's war effort, America remained neutral throughout 1940 and until early December 1941. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan struck at Pearl Harbor. The American government and people were suddenly embroiled in a war in the Pacific. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. Sorry, where am I? On the afternoon of 5 August 1943, this is Churchill returning to the United States, Churchill and the 3 British chiefs of staff sailed on the Queen Mary from the River Clyde. They used the 5-day transatlantic voyage to discuss every aspect of the war plans for the year ahead. I think I've screwed up something. Sorry, can we backtrack? Will you forgive me? So we've gone from December 41, when Hitler declared war on the United States. Sorry. Within a month of Hitler's declaration of war, Martin always believed in following the chronology, and hopefully you'll forgive me, but we'll now go back to the chronology. Within a month of Hitler's declaration of the war on the United States, Churchill traveled to Washington to see President Roosevelt to secure an American commitment to the defeat of Germany in Europe before the defeat of Japan. His views fell on fertile ground. In the autumn of 1941, one of the leading American strategic thinkers, General Albert C. Wedemeyer, a staff officer in the War Department in Washington, who as a captain had spent 3 years before the war at the German Staff College in Berlin, had presented a victory plan that stressed the massive mobilization of resources and manpower that would be needed to defeat Germany in the event of war. Our principal theater of war is Central Europe, he wrote. Africa, the Near East, Spain, Scandinavia, and the Far East would be subsidiary theaters. At the Washington Conference in December 1941, codenamed Arcadia, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their military staffs agreed as a basis of Anglo-American strategy that, quote, only the minimum forces necessary for the safeguarding of vital interests in other theaters should be diverted from operations against Germany. Following this guideline and adopting the central theme of General Wedemeyer's earlier plan, on 20 February 1942, General Eisenhower, recently appointed director of the War Plans Division, confirmed his support for offensive operations in the European theater and concurrently defensive operations in all others. So now we return to the United States, and we're up to 1943. On the afternoon of 5 August 1943, Churchill and the 3 British chiefs of staff sailed on the Queen Mary from the River Clyde. They used the 5-day transatlantic voyage to discuss every aspect of the war plans for the year ahead. Predominant among them, the cross-channel invasion, on which so much preparatory work had been done in the previous 6 months. The head of Churchill's defense staff, General Ismay, later recalled how, quote, if a stranger had visited his bathroom, he might have seen a stocky figure in a dressing gown of many colors, sitting on a stool and surrounded by a number of what our American friends called top brass, while an admiral flapped his hands in the water at one end of the bath in order to simulate a choppy sea, and the brigadier stretched a lilo across the middle to show how it broke up the waves. The stranger would have found it hard to believe that this was the British High Command studying the most stupendous and spectacular amphibious operation in the history of war. Turning now to one of Churchill's concerns, the loss of life from bombing. This in the spring of 1944 from Churchill Alive, which I want to add is coming out in an exciting new edition this autumn. As the plans for the cross-channel attack proceeded, Churchill was worried about the scale of French civilian casualties likely to be caused by the planned bombing of railway lines and rail junctions in northern France prior to the attack. Such casualties were estimated at between 20 and 40,000. Considering that they are our friends, Churchill wrote to Eisenhower, this might be held to be an act of very great severity, bringing much hatred on the Allied air forces. Eisenhower agreed to reduce the scale of the bombing, but even so, it was severe, and at least 5,000 French civilians were killed. On May 10, Churchill reached the 4th anniversary of his premiership, more than 200 weeks of responsibility and worry. Above all was the frightening specter of the Normandy landings. To an American visitor, John J. McCloy, the Undersecretary for War, Churchill confided, "If you think I'm dragging my feet, it's not because I can't take casualties. It's because I'm afraid of what those casualties will be." He then told McCloy of the large number of his contemporaries who had been killed in what he called the hecatombs of the First World War. He himself was a sort of sport in nature's sense, as most of his generation lay dead at Passchendaele and the Somme. An entire British generation of potential leaders had been cut off, and Britain could not afford the loss of another generation. In 2008, to support a campaign to have Bomber Command receive a campaign medal, Martin wrote a pamphlet called Churchill and British Bombing Policy, 1914 to 1954. This reading goes back to Churchill's concern about the bombings in France. Churchill asked Eisenhower to set a limit for each raid of, he suggested, an estimated 100 dead. Eisenhower declined. Churchill then put the matter to Roosevelt. These slaughters, he told the president, may easily bring about a great revulsion in French feeling towards their approaching United States and British liberators. They may leave a legacy of hate behind them. The president supported Eisenhower, telling Churchill, I'm not prepared to impose from this distance any restriction on military action by the responsible commanders that, in their opinion, might militate against the success of overlord or cause additional loss of life to our allied forces of invasion. The bombing went ahead. The casualties were high, more than 4,000 civilian dead, but far fewer than feared, and the railway disruptions were effective. So now we are close to the day itself. How did the leaders prepare? This is from Martin's D-Day. On the morning of June 5, Eisenhower wrote a message in his own hand to be published in the event of failure. It read, our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I've withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He was that concerned that it was so precarious. The meeting at Eisenhower's headquarters at 4:15 that morning was, Air Vice Marshal Robb noted, very brief. The overnight weather charts were examined and nothing was found to alter the previous evening's decision to go. The orders had already gone out to start the day's military, air, and naval moves. During June 5, a message from Montgomery was read to all troops preparing to embark for Normandy. Their commander-in-chief had his own distinctive style and also a quotation from the 17th century soldier poet, the Earl of Montrose. Monty's message read, 1. The time has come to deal the enemy a terrific blow in Western Europe. The blow will be struck by the combined sea, land, and air forces of the Allies, together constituting one great Allied team under the supreme command of General Eisenhower. 2. On the eve of this great adventure, I send my best wishes to every soldier in the Allied team. To us is given the honor of striking a blow for freedom, which will live in history. And in the better days that lie ahead, men will speak with pride of our doings. We have a great and a righteous cause. Let us pray that the Lord mighty in battle will go forth with our armies, and that his special providence will aid us in the struggle. 3, I want every soldier to know that I have complete confidence in the successful outcome of the operations that we are now about to begin. With stout hearts and with enthusiasm for the contest, let us go forward to victory. 4, and as we enter the battle, let us recall the words of a famous soldier spoken many years ago. He either fears his fate too much, or his deserts are small, who dare not put it to the touch, to win or lose it all. 5. Good luck to each one of you, and good hunting on the mainland of Europe. On the afternoon of June 5, the German Army Intelligence Service informed General Jodl that the previous night, the 2 lines of poetry from a poem by Paul Verlaine had been heard by the security section of the 15th Army. These were the 2 lines that had been given as the warning order to one of the resistance circuits about imminent invasion, to be followed by the more immediate warning of 48 hours notice. Jodl and his advisors took no action. The lines gave no clue as to their meaning. However, the commander-in-chief of the 15th Army, Colonel General Hans von Salmuth, sensed that something was afoot and ordered standby on the evening of June 5. But even he waited to give the order until shortly before midnight, after he had received, quote, numerous reports of major sea and air movements from his intelligence service. It must therefore be presumed, commented General Walter Warlimont, who was serving in Hitler's headquarters at the time, that none of those involved, including Jodl, attached much importance to the information. Alternatively, he wrote, they may have been waiting for some more definite confirmation. The Allies used deceptions to keep the Germans guessing as to their plans. Some of the deceptions on the day are described in D-Day. During the night of June 5-6, the first 3,000 of more than 7,000 Allied warships, British, American, Canadian, Polish, Dutch, Norwegian, French, and Greek, the combined forces of Operation Neptune, were crossing the Channel, bringing the first of more than 150,000 men who were to land during the day. As this vast armada drew even closer to the Normandy beaches, a new series of deceptions was launched to draw the German attention to other possible destinations. One deception, using motor launchers and radio signals to simulate the movement of a large convoy, was a spurious cross-channel assault toward the beaches between Le Havre and Dieppe. A second, designed to suggest a similar amphibious threat east of Le Havre, was carried out by motor launches off Harfleur. A third deception, Operation Glimmer, took the form of a substantial air attack on the fortifications in the Pas-de-Calais. A fourth deception that night, the largest of the 4, Operation Taxable, was twofold. The dropping of dummy parachutists near Boulogne, together with the dropping over the Channel of tens of thousands of radar jamming metallic strips known as window. These strips were dropped in such a way as to produce on German radar screens the appearance of a large, slow-moving convoy making its way across the Channel toward the Pas-de-Calais. The window drop was carried out by Group Captain Leonard Cheshire's 617 Squadron. The operation had to be timed to perfection so that the clouds of metal strips dropped at precise intervals by successive waves of aircraft gave the impression to the German radar watchers of the steady approach of shipping at a speed of 9 knots. Any aberration, explained Cheshire's 1992 obituary in the Times of London, would have given the game away. Underneath the clouds of window as it fell were Royal Navy motor gunboats in Operation Moonshine, carrying special electronic equipment that could respond to German radar signals by amplifying and repeating their pulse, so that a single gunboat showed all the symptoms of many large ships. Experimented with since 1942, moonshine was the first use of this radar deception in a large-scale amphibious landing. It was yet another component of the vast, intricate assemblage that made up the D-Day plan. The Pas-de-Calais deception worked. The Phantom Armada was clearly visible on German radar, diverting the attention of the German coastal and fighter defenses away from the real invasion force that was even then heading toward the beaches of Normandy, 150 miles to the southwest. Indeed, as the bogus convoy came within range of the massive German 12-inch gun batteries in the Pas-de-Calais, those guns fired salvo after salvo at the clouds of descending tinsel. In broadcasting the first German account of the Normandy landings on the following day, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, added that there were landing troops outside Calais and Dunkirk. In the early hours of June 6, two groups of parachutists, a dozen in each group, dropped near the town of Isigny, 10 miles southeast of Omaha Beach. It was the ultimate deception operation, ordered by the ever-inventive Colonel Bevan and the London Controlling Section. Codenamed Titanic, its aim was to distract the Germans by pretending that it constituted a major parachute landing. One of its planners was Captain M.R.D. Foote, who had earlier been involved in choosing areas in France where German reinforcements to Normandy could most effectively be harried by the French resistance under SOE guidance. Foote was later to be the historian of SOE in France, that Special Operations Executive. Excuse me. Two groups of parachutists, each of 5 men, members of the Special Air Service Brigade, took part in Titanic. On landing on French soil, they fired very lights to illuminate the bogus dropping zone and played recordings on gramophone records of small arms fire interspersed with soldiers' conversation. In addition to the real drop, 1,000 dummy parachutists were dropped to give the impression of a major landing. As its planners in Whitehall intended, Operation Titanic deceived the Germans. At 3 in the morning, which was 3.5 hours before the Omaha Beach landings, the German 915th Infantry Regiment, the reserve brigade of the division holding the sector, was sent eastward to, quote, counter an airborne threat near Isigny, and spent the whole morning while the Americans who had landed at Omaha were at their most vulnerable, searching for the spurious Titanic parachutists in the woods around Isigny and even exchanging fire with them. By the time the German regiment was sent to Omaha, where fighting had been particularly severe, the American troops there had finally managed to secure the beachhead. In the regiment, writes M.R.D. Foote, Titanic is remembered as a disaster for a sound regimental reason. Of the 10 men who went on it, only 2 came back. But it was a masterpiece of successful deception. Without it, the Americans on Omaha might have been thrown back into the sea. As the real parachutists at Utah and Sword worked in darkness on what had been enemy-occupied soil for the previous 4 years, 1,000 aircraft of Royal Air Force Bomber Command began a sustained attack on the main German coastal batteries in the area soon to be assaulted from the sea. 2 of the bomber squadrons were in action for the first time, consisting of Free French pilots and aircrew, who were attached to a British bomber group. Their specific target was the fortified German gun emplacements outside Grand Camp Mézy, with their clear line of fire on what within a few hours was to be the Utah beach. As the planes of RAF Bomber Command left the assault area, more than 1,000 United States bombers of the 8th Air Force took over. And in the 30 minutes before the troops were to land, they dropped 2,796 tons of bombs on the same coastal defenses. That morning above the Irish Sea and the Bay of Biscay, a Czechoslovak air squadron took part in Operation Cork, a 21-squadron operation to intercept and destroy all German submarines making their way to the Channel to interrupt the Allied Armada. Ultra decrypts gave the British a clear picture of the movement of all 36 U-boats that had been ordered from their bases on the Atlantic coast of France to the Channel. 17 left from Brest, 4 from Saint-Nazaire, 4 from La Pallice, and 1 from Lorient. All but 9 of them, not fitted with a snorkel apparatus, had to surface regularly to recharge their batteries and top up their high-pressure air. That made them exceedingly vulnerable to air attack. What did the Germans believe? This from Volume 2 of Martin's History of the 20th Century. These are quite hefty books. And see. Hitler was not convinced that this was the main thrust of the Allied attack. The deception schemes that had been mounted so carefully convinced him that the real landings would come either in the area of Dieppe or near Calais, or perhaps even on the Belgian coast. He knew that the 1st United States Army Group had not moved from East Anglia. In fact, as it did not exist as a fighting force, it was only as a figment of Britain's conniving and of Hitler's imagination. Fearing, however, that the Normandy landing were a deception, that evening Hitler alerted all German units in the Channel and North Sea to be prepared to meet attacks elsewhere. The British, decrypting this instruction, realized they still had time to put men ashore before the full force of the German defenders was brought to bear on the actual landing grounds. On the night of June 6-7, 1,000 British bombers struck at German lines of communication throughout the Normandy area. Considerable damage was done to railway lines near Lisieux and Coutances, but the 2 towns were also hit. In Coutances, more than half of the town center was destroyed and 312 French civilians killed. Hitler and his military advisors still could not convince themselves that Normandy was the main Allied target. Even the previous night's bombing of the railway lines leading to Normandy could be a skillful deception. On June 7, as the Allied positions on the beachhead were steadily consolidated, the German Air Force High Command was still warning its units throughout Western Europe that further landings might take place at any moment, either toward Belgium or on the western coast, the western side of the Cotentin Peninsula, across the peninsula from Utah Beach, or on the French Atlantic coast near Lorient, or even on the Norwegian coast. What did Churchill report to the House of Commons that day? This is from Martin's multi-volume biography, the document volume number 20, Normandy and Beyond. So I just need to clear some space here. This is Churchill's speech to the House of Commons, in which he begins speaking about Italy. And then he goes on. I have also to announce that to the House that during the night and the early hours of the morning, the first of a series of landings in force upon the European continent has taken place. In this case, the liberating assault fell upon the coast of France. An immense armada of upwards of 4,000 ships, together with several thousand smaller craft, crossed the Channel. Massed airborne landings have been successfully effected behind the enemy lines, and landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points at the present time. The fire of the shore batteries has been largely quelled. The obstacles that were constructed in the sea have not proved so difficult as was apprehended. The Anglo-American allies are sustained by about 11,000 first-line aircraft, which can be drawn upon as may be needed for the purpose of the battle. I cannot, of course, commit myself to any particular details. Reports are coming in rapid succession. So far, the commanders who are engaged report that everything is proceeding according to plan. And what a plan. This vast operation is undoubtedly the most complicated and difficult that has ever occurred. It involves tides, wind, waves, visibility, both from the air and the sea standpoint, and the combined employment of land, air, and sea forces in the highest degree of intimacy and in contact with conditions which could not and cannot be fully foreseen. There are already hopes that actual tactical surprise has been attained, and we hope to furnish the enemy with a succession of surprises during the course of the fighting. The battle that has now begun will grow constantly in scale and in intensity for many weeks to come, and I shall not attempt to speculate upon its course. This I may say, however, complete unity prevails throughout the Allied armies. There is a brotherhood in arms between us and our friends in the United States. There is complete confidence in the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, and his lieutenants, and also in the commander of the Expeditionary Force, General Montgomery. The ardor and spirit of the troops, as I saw myself, embarking in these last few days, was splendid to witness. Nothing that equipment, science, or forethought could do has been neglected, and the whole process of opening this great new front will be pursued with the utmost resolution, both by the commanders and by the United States and British government whom they serve. I'd like to finish now by turning to Martin's preface in his D-Day book. Martin calls the 6th of June a turning point. The Allied landings in 1944 might have been a disaster. Winston Churchill thought he would be woken up to be told of massive casualties. General Eisenhower prepared a short, solemn broadcast announcing that the enterprise had failed. D-Day in military parlance is the starting day of any offensive. In 1943, there had been both a Sicily D-Day and an Italy D-Day before the cross-channel assault. But because the Normandy landings on 6 June 1944 marked so significant a turning point in the Second World War, the term D-Day has come to signify that day alone. My aim in these pages is to show how that turning point in history came about. The period of preparation, lasting almost 2 years amid the strains and uncertainties of war elsewhere, was one of inventiveness, hard work, experimentation, secrecy, and wide-ranging deception plans. This was no chance or accidental turning point, but a calculated, planned, evolving, intricate struggle to ensure the overthrow of a tyrannical regime and to liberate those who had suffered under its harsh rule for 4 years. It was a struggle that involved men and women in offices and factories, in training camps and clandestine venues, almost none of them knowing the specific destination, working as a vast team to put together a comprehensive plan that would ensure the destruction of Hitler and his regime and the liberation of the captive peoples of Europe. The turning point of 6 June 1944 owed its evolution and impact to many individuals and groups of individuals. Among them were the two statesmen, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose joint vision it was, despite disagreements and hesitations along the way. To General George C. Marshall and General Sir Alan Brooke, the respected heads of the vast American and British military organizations, who worked for it at the highest level of strategic planning. To General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General Bernard Montgomery, the American Supreme Commander and the British Commander-in-Chief respectively, who had to carry out the strategy and work together in tandem. There were also the two staffs of both these commanders, men and women, who had to coordinate 100 different enterprises, and to the special organizations within those staffs, working to devise a successful amphibious landing on a scale never before attempted. Others without whom the whole vast enterprise could not have been launched were the intelligence chiefs, who masterminded the sending of Allied agents into Europe and who controlled the double agents in Britain, through whom the essential deception plans were promoted. Then there were the factory workers and engineers and builders and technicians and inventors who made the wide array of equipment needed. Much was also owed to the pilots and air crews who were in action long before D-Day, on the day itself, and after it, helping to ensure success. To the sailors who cleared the seas and transported the invasion force and kept it supplied. And above all, to the soldiers of all Allied armies, all ranks and all branches of the armed services who trained for action, and then went into action on the beaches and landing grounds of Normandy, and then fought their way across the continent. It was a collective effort on an unprecedented scale. Without that effort, the turning point would have been impossible. Those who planned for a successful turning point had two unexpected advantages, one of which was beyond their control, the other of which they engineered. These were both mistakes made by their enemy. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States 6 months after he had invaded the Soviet Union ensured that he had to confront a second powerful adversary before he had defeated the first. The Normandy landings would not have been possible without the substantial participation of the United States. Hitler's second mistake was carefully encouraged by the Allies. His belief that the real destination of the Allied forces, even after the landings had been made on the Normandy coast, was elsewhere, at the Pas de Calais. But the possibility always remained until after the actual landings, that if the Germans decided to bring their maximum forces to bear on the beachhead, the Allied armies could be defeated on the shore. Despite the enormous energy and ingenuity that went into the planning for D-Day, and despite the successful deception, the specter of failure was always present. A failed Allied landing would not only have been a setback, it could also have been a disaster for the Allied cause. Hitler's regime would have seen an opportunity to regain the ascendant, and it possessed the means to do so. New terrifying flying bombs and even more powerful rocket bombs with their 1-ton warheads were almost ready to be launched. Long-distance submarines were in the final stage of development, and these would enable Hitler's naval power to reach the eastern seaboard of the United States without having to refuel at sea. In addition, a mine against which there was no known defense was in the final stages of preparation. The first examples were actually used on D-Day. Relieved from the need to fight an Allied army in the West, an enormous quantity of planes, tanks, troops, and armaments, a third of Germany's first-class fighting forces, would have been available to meet the Soviet Eastern offensive which had been planned by the Allies to follow the Normandy landings. The last remaining Jews of Europe, more than 1 million, were listed for deportation and death. The collaborators, trains, and gas chambers would have been available to seek them out and deport them to internment and to their deaths. Failure at Normandy could have given Hitler, whose armies and Gestapo were in occupation or control from the Atlantic coast of France to the Polish-Soviet borderlands, the prospect of victory. The Soviet Union, after 3 years of war, was still fighting the German forces on its own soil and still bleeding and burning on its own territory. Britain did not have the resources for a second amphibious assault without the United States. If the American armies had been forced to leave Normandy bloodied and defeated, the United States may well have decided, after 2.5 years of focusing on the war in North Africa and Europe, to turn its main energies to the ever-growing demands of the war in the Pacific. And Europe would have been left to its own devices. Had that happened, I doubt that I, a 7-year-old British schoolboy at the time of the landings, would be alive to write this book, or free to express my opinions without fear of imprisonment or death. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. That was a really powerful note to finish on, and those readings were just wonderful. It just really shows the way that Sir Martin brought this history so vividly to life. And I particularly loved the piece where you read about the deception plans and those metallic strips, sort of this phantom armada, as you said, with this impression, creating this impression at regular intervals of these ships moving at 9 knots. That's incredible. And another thing that struck me on your PowerPoint were those maps of Martin's, and that's something that's resonated with the audience, because I've had a question. How did Martin go about creating those maps that are one of his hallmarks, I think it would be fair to say? How did he go about creating them?
Martin was always interested in maps. In fact, he wanted, when he was in school, he wanted to study geography, to read geography, and his masters in school said, geography isn't a real topic, you go into history, which he did. He began when he was teaching at Oxford, and he would come and to his class and draw out the map of whatever they were doing on the blackboard. And the next time when he came into class with his students, the maps were gone, and there were math calculations or whatever the next class was. One of his students suggested that he put the maps on paper, and another one suggested that he created an atlas. So he has 9 historical atlases in print. And in fact, most of these maps, I think, came from the Second World War Atlas, which covers the whole range of the war. He has maps in every one of his books, and he made sure to any place mentioned in the text of the book would be shown on a map. I use the maps from the Second World War Atlas purely because I had better copies of them. I had PDFs of them, whereas this is a smaller book and the maps are harder to scan. So that was that. But how did he do it? He was always interested in going to the places where history had happened and to describing it on a map, figuring out the distance between one place and the next. When he left for the morning and he went, what was the distance? How long did it take to get there? So that was his interest, and the maps developed. So he would draw them, list the places that he wanted, and figure out what story he wanted to tell on each map, and then draw it out on tracing paper and send it to his cartographer, who would then create a PDF, and things would go back and forth until he got it right. And Martin knew the geography so well that he could tell if the city was on the wrong side of the river and make sure that was corrected. So one of the many things that I felt were way over my head and past my skill set when I sort of took up the reins of this was to do the maps, that I just felt I don't know the geography well enough. But luckily, he left a lot of maps.
I'm very grateful for his careful attention to detail as always with those maps. They really are an enhancement. We've got lots of questions, so I'll try and get through as many as I can. Someone's asked, did Churchill and King George want to join the landing? I don't know if Martin wrote about that.
He might have written about it. I don't, let me just say my disclaimer. When Martin and I would go out for dinner or whatever, we were separated and he's talking and I'm sitting there between people who I don't know. And they would turn to me and they'd say, are you a writer also? Are you an author also? And I would say, I'm a reader. So now through the center, I have found a calling of being a reader. So I don't know, honestly, the history to know. It will be there. If you look on martingilbert.com, I have each of the books described, and the indexes that are available, that we have available on PDF, are on the website. So you can go through the indexes and then search on the index on the PDF to see. And with Churchill, there will be a whole description. However, Churchill is, because Martin did itemized indexes. So it's not just page numbers, it's descriptions. So the short, honest answer is I really don't know. The information may be available, but I'm afraid I can't honestly say yes or no and stay out of trouble.
That's fine. We can just advise people to go away and read about it, which is always a good thing to do. I don't know if you've encountered this either, but did Sir Martin Gilbert ever write about his personal recollection of D-Day as it happened while he was a 7-year-old boy? I don't know if you came across that in your readings.
No, he didn't write anything autobiographical. I mean, when I found this in the preface, that's sort of the most personal he gets. He wrote In Search of Churchill, which is sort of his approach and how he came to write the Churchill biography. And that is sort of autobiographical.
Perfect.
But otherwise, no. But he was evacuated 4 times. Many children and families were evacuated during before the war and during, to move them away from the coast and to move them where they would be safer. And Martin was evacuated 4 times. I think the first time to Cornwall, I'm not sure about the second time, the third time to Canada for 3 years. And he came back in 1944 and he was evacuated with his family to Wales. But he didn't write about what it was like. But his interest in the Holocaust, I think, was because he realized that had he been born in Europe, and he was 3 when the war started, that he wouldn't have survived, and that his generation of children were murdered. So he was always very sensitive to that. But I haven't come across anything that's much more autobiographical than that. He was very much about the history and this is what happened, without putting himself into the picture, sadly for us. But that was his style.
Brilliant. Just so many questions that I'm trying to keep on top of them, keep them coming there. We'll get through as many as we can. I know Esther's always very generous with her time. Someone has asked, to what extent did the rapid Soviet advancement in the East influence any decisions or timings of D-Day, if at all? So that sort of pressure.
Again, I don't know, but a lot of Martin writes that they were, in 1944, they were still fighting on Soviet territory. A lot of the supplies before 41, before the Americans were involved, supplies that came through Lend-Lease were sent on to the Soviet Union to keep them in the war. So I think the first doses of penicillin were given to Red Army soldiers. And there's a lot of material, and probably it's in the Second World War, about what material was sent to the Soviet Union to keep them strong, to keep them going. But again, I'm sorry.
That's
I'm
okay.
just
Never any need to
the books are
apologize.
there.
And for those of you who were wondering about Churchill and King George, there's some really elucidating comments in the chat. Basically, the story seems to be, or that the account is, that Eisenhower asked the King's intervention to prevent Churchill going with the Armada on a British ship. So the King threatened to go too, which made Winston Churchill pull out with reluctance. So thank you for that, Glenda. And thank you, Eugene, also, who's messaged to say, Churchill wanted to go, and George said, if you do, then I will too. So that made Winston change his mind, quite understandably. So thank you for those comments. We've got another question. Obviously, today we're marking the 80th anniversary of D-Day, but someone's asked, was Martin involved in any previous anniversaries of D-Day? Obviously, being quite an expert in this field. Do you know of any previous occasions he was involved in?
I do not, but after he had been taken ill, I got a call from, it was D-Day, from Christian Amanpour from CNN, who wanted to interview him for D-Day. And I said, I'm sure he would have loved to, but he won't be able to. I don't know of any specifics. He took a group of friends, and Sir Harry Solomon was among them. Every year they would do a historical tour, and they did a tour of Normandy in 2004. And in fact, he dedicated his book D-Day, dedicated to my fellow travelers in Normandy during our visit in 2003. And he lists them. I believe on the website, I have if you search D-Day or Normandy, I think there's a photo of Martin reading on the beach, reading to his group. So I'm afraid I don't know specifics.
That's okay. We're just glad to be celebrating it or marking it today in this way with you. So thank you. And I'm sure it's something that Martin would have very much approved of. Mindy's asked, what induced Martin to focus on the Second World War? Did any of his family serve?
I believe his father was too old. He may have been part of the Home Guard, was it? No, Martin lost family in the Holocaust in Poland, and in Lithuania. What induced him to write about the Second World War? Martin wrote his official biography of Winston Churchill. Let me just see if I can show you the black and white shelf on top. He was part of Randolph Churchill's research team, and when Randolph wrote the first 2 volumes, and then Martin was asked to carry it on and wrote the further 6 volumes, and there are now 23 volumes of documents. In that time, in the 20 years that it took him to write it, I think he learned a lot about the 20th century and the First and Second World War and the history of the 20th century and Churchill and the Holocaust and all the things that were going on at that time. So I think it prepared him. And he said that in between writing, when he finished one of his Churchill volumes, he would do something else. He would write something else to sort of clear his mind. So that's where these other books came in. And he collected material as he was going through Churchill documents or other documents. He collected material and he like this obituary from 1992 that he got. He would have saved it, and then when he was ready to write about that particular topic, he had all of his documents, all of his archive, and his books in front of him. So, and he had done all of his own research, so he knew when he sat down what he wanted to write. So I think the 20th century fascinated him, and that's what he knew. And the Second World War was a huge part of that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so Mindy asked, was it, just this World War II focus? But absolutely not. I mean, he's got his books all about the 20th century, almost cataloguing the 20th century. It's incredible. And of course, as you showed us those biographies of Winston Churchill, he was really wrote about so many elements. But as you say, the world wars were very important, crucial moments in the 20th century. So it's just the array of works that he created over his lifetime are quite frankly astonishing. Someone's asked, is the D-Day book due to be reissued this year? Is there going to be an anniversary edition?
I'm hoping, but no. But it is
Okay.
available. It is in print. I think there's an ebook. It's he reached a point after writing these massive books where he said, maybe it's okay to write shorter books now. So this is a mirror, not including the maps and the index. A lot of maps. Just a second. It is a mere 180 pages.
Just a brief read.
Yes, there is a new edition of Churchill of Life coming out in September, October, November for the I think it's the 150th anniversary of Churchill's birth. So that will be exciting.
And am I right in thinking that recently his atlases have been reprinted?
There
For those
are
map lovers.
9 atlases in print. I have updated 3 of them: Holocaust History, First World War, and Jewish History Atlas. Again, as I said, I don't, his publisher's editor wanted me to create new atlases, new maps. And I said, I can't do the maps, but let's take them from his other books. So we've sort of cobbled together 3 new atlases, and it's again on the website. But that's exciting, and the indexes are up to date. And I've been able to add interesting introductions from scholars, and that's been fun to do.
Perfect. Thank you, Esther. I think that seems like people are sharing their thanks in the chat, so I'll be able to convey these messages to you later once I've saved everything. But that seems a really nice moment to thank you, not only for keeping all of Martin's works published and in print for us. We all enjoy reading them. We enjoy your readings very, very much. Thank you all for joining us today, and a huge thank you, of course, to Lady Esther. It's great to have Martin's scholarship brought to life by you, and it's wonderful to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day with everyone here today. Before you go, for those of you based in or around London in the UK, our final talk of the term will be taking place in person on the 19th of June, where we'll also be awarding prizes to the winners of the Sir Martin Gilbert History Prize. So I hope you can join us then. But if not, we will be in touch soon with some more online events. And thank you all, and thanks once more, Esther. And a good day to you all. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.